Okay, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show. I'm Eric Eager. I'm joined by Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, we're on episode 88 now. Famous 88s. You think about Michael Irvin, you think about Alan Page, the honorable one. Some Tony Gonzalez from your time as the Atlanta Falcons general manager, and obviously a Kansas City Chief great. Probably you brought this up yesterday. Arguably a better career once he got to Atlanta, but tight ends, they age, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about that. They age gracefully, the ones that have made it to the promised land. Thomas, how was your weekend?
Weekend was great. You just sent me a text and you said it was rather biblical weather. I thought, what a really cool point that was. It was blowing like Noah's Ark or whatever it was. This is Atlanta weather, though.
It was weird. This same thing happened. I'm trying to remember which day, but like the same thing happened just a couple days ago, where it was just like I wanted to go on the bike. I wanted to get, I biked to the gym, and all of a sudden it's raining sideways, and I'm just like, okay, well, this isn't going to work. It was nice enough to like walk around, and it was like hot, just like an hour and a half ago when I was taking some meetings, and then and to the point where we were going to postpone because my power had gone out like 3 or 4 times in a row. But we soldier on. And speaking of soldiering on, we're in training camp right now. We're in the belly of the beast. I know we were talking earlier today about kind of like the league calendar and all of that kind of stuff, and how it's kind of a little bit different now that we're on like sort of the vendor side. Versus when you were on the team side, and how this is, kind of like when a lot of people on the vendor side want to take some time off, where you're kind of right in the middle here of the season. Thomas, week 2 or 3 of training camp, depending on how new you are, what's sort of going through your head right now as a team builder?
If I were still to be with the team, you're saying, or me as the outsider now? Look, I mean, during that time, you're praying that the guys that you spent the money on and your really talented eye on work out, of course. You're hoping that not only is it from a skill standpoint, you're hoping they're mixing with the players. You hope they're mixing with their coaches, their new position coaches. I mean, you have so much on your mind. You want to talk about being a little bit of a nervous Nelly as a team builder during this time as a GM. You just want things to fall into place. And you want people, and biggest thing, as you know, you want people to maintain their health. The last thing you need is one of those catastrophes. And you just pray with each day that people are being smart about how they're doing things, they're working hard, they're showing well, and they stay healthy.
Yeah, there have been a couple of acquisitions, not so much to deal with injuries, but to deal with, and we're going to talk kind of like why these players are available versus other players a little bit later, but there have been some acquisitions that have been notable over the past week. Yannick Ngakoue, former Penn State defensive end, who was part of a really good Jaguars defense in 2017. Pro Bowler then, has kind of, he had his ordeal. I actually want to talk about this with you because, like 3 years ago, right, he was kind of in a Twitter match with Tony Khan about contracts and all that. They trade him to Minnesota. Minnesota then struggles out of the gate. Then they trade him to Baltimore. He leaves via free agent, becomes a Raider, then becomes a Colt. Now he's a Chicago Bear at about $10.5 million per season. They get Mercedes Lewis as well. Some of that is to obviously get above the spending floor because they still currently have, I believe, $28 million in cap space. If I'm not mistaken, they have a lot of money. They needed to get up to the cap floor. Thomas, when you think about Ngakoue as a player, what are the first things that come to your mind? And B, is there something to, if you're a team builder, a guy who now you're on team 5 in the last 4 years, how does that does that ever override your own evaluation of a player?
Well, first, let's talk about him as a player. He is a hell of a pass rusher. He's talented. He can get up and around. He can get off the ball. We were talking about that the other day in our meetings, right? About get off time and get off ability. Mm-hmm. He has the ability to do that. He's special. He's one of the first, or I forget what the quote or the stat was. In the last 7 years, he's had 8 sacks every year, right? At least 8 sacks every year, I believe it. That's big time production. Some of the people that I know from some of the past teams he's been with have mentioned to me, like, look, the reality is this guy's very good. He's of course, talented. He's got a big impression of himself, which I think in the NFL you have to, reflective of the fact possibly that each time he turns a corner, he's trying to negotiate a new deal. It's a big deal. He thinks highly of himself, and he should be. He's a good football player, as I mentioned. But teams don't normally move on from pass rushers who are as talented as he is if there's not something that they have to deal with. Again, I am in no way saying he is a bad person. I'm just saying he has high expectations, high dollar expectations, and there are teams out there that are, not looking to spend that money. So it will be interesting to see. Here he is now. He goes into the Chicago Bears, a team I think that did not even have 20 sacks last year. This is an important acquisition for them. The last thing I'll say now, remember, however, his strength is not playing the run game. So when you're a D-line player like that and you're really talented pass rushing and you have an offensive coordinator out there honing in on that player and you're like, all right, this cat's in here. Let's do some run off the edge here and see what we can produce. It becomes complicated.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's always the ding, like whether or not, we were just doing a wins above replacement model at Sumer kind of like on the back end, probably, I will say best in industry right now at Sumer Sports. And Ngakoue, the run defense was always going to ding him. And he had never, whether you look at Pro Football Focus or you just look at the teams that have been, that he's been on, they have not been good run defense teams. Even that Jacksonville defense of 2017 was more of a lights out, stop the pass defense than it was, and they had guys like Calais and Marcel Darius and guys like that were able to help him on the interior. I worry about that when I think about the Bears, because to your point, they needed pass rush a lot. And they only had 20 sacks last year. And Ngakoue had 9.5 himself. He has 19.5 total over the last 2 years, which is as many as the Bears basically had last year. So it helps. But I do worry, because what if that team ends up being good, needing to stop the run in an important part, and the one guy that's making the most money on your defensive line is a liability there? That's tough. But on the other end, you think about it, if this team were to get good and they were to have leads, they need a guy to actually shut down an opposing offense when they have a lead. And Ngakoue has been so good there. Speaking of, though, an edge player who's older, but a very accomplished player, both against the run and against the pass. Justin Houston actually just signed, and this is recent. It's not even in our notes, but he just signed with Carolina, a team that traded with the Bears this offseason. The Panthers have Brian Burns. Now they have Justin Houston. Houston has been, he's drafted by your friend Scott Pioli. He's one of the, third round pick, tremendous value for the Chiefs. People don't give Pioli a lot of credit, but that's a Chiefs Hall of Famer that he drafted there. And the thing that Houston doesn't have, people don't complain about Justin Houston in, is he does stop the run. In addition to being one of the better pass rushers in the league, he only cost $7 million, in large part because he's 4 years old, 3, 4, 5 years younger than Ngakoue. Why? I want to ask a broader question. Edge is a very important position, and yet this time of year, there's always like Melvin Ingram's available, Jadeveon Clowney's available, Justin Houston's available, Yannick Ngakoue's available. Why are there edge players that are available this time of year, given how important the position is?
I feel they're smart about what they're doing and what their agents are doing. Now, remember, back to Ngakoue, I think he's on his 4th or 5th agent as well. Right. So that's a whole other thing that you're dealing with. Besides that, we've been around them before. I've been in organizations where we've brought the elder statesman in, so to speak. They don't lose their talent. They may be losing a little bit of step, a little bit of explosiveness, or more than a little bit, but they still can get up. They still can combine with a really good and evolving pass rush. And I think they're important. They set a tone. They're good in the meeting room normally if you're bringing someone like that in, right? You have to be smart. We've had people in the past who are really good with the young guys, right? Talking fine-tuned nuances of pass rush, which I think can be very beneficial. So I think a lot of times those guys hold out and they wait, and then eventually they know that there's going to be someone looking for an adept enough, pass rusher that could get 4 to 8 sacks potentially, depending on how it all plays out.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about like the Lions Cardinals, all those teams that signed Dwight Freeney well into his career. Those guys being available. Clowney's always an interesting case too, because he's always going to cost that $10 million because he's a first overall pick and he's got a tremendous amount of talent. But he's starting to become that guy that doesn't stay places for very long for whatever reason. And that can be troubling, even however talented he is. And I think Clowney's an interesting one too, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but Clowney is a very good all-around defensive end. I would not necessarily put him in the category of Ngakoue as a pure pass rusher. He's more of a good all-around player, which kind of, I think, hurts his market because you're not necessarily going to sign that guy to a $20 million deal given his past. By the way, that's a little bit of what's going on here in Alpharetta, Georgia. And you're not necessarily going to sign him as a pure pass rusher either, because that's not necessarily where his skill set is. And so he's kind of a man without a market, Thomas.
Yeah, and there are a number of players like that are, of course, are men without markets. But, again, I don't know where he is right now and what's the expected market on him at this point. I haven't been following him that much, so I don't want to.
I think he's expecting 8 to 12 like he has for the last few years, and he's been sort of available there. Yeah, look at that, Tom. Okay, let's continue to go. By the way, I'm just gonna get this read in here because we want to make sure that we're paying our bills here. We are sponsored by Circa Sports. They have a tremendous competition coming up at the end of the month. A few of us from Sumer are going to be there. Circasports.com. Go ahead and check them out. They are our sponsor for this show for the next month or so, which we're really happy about. If the power does kill, Thomas and I are probably just going to end the podcast here just to make sure everybody is safe here. We have lost power a few times, so I'm just going to throw that out there. One last thing I want to ask you about go ahead, Thomas.
Where's our Circa Sports shirts? Man, I want to. We're t-shirt guys. We love
Thomas. I'm gonna go get you some when we go to Vegas. Our friend Aaron, the guy that runs all promotions there, he has not sent us shirts. Manscaped did send us shirts. They weren't as good of a sponsor as Circa, but they did send us shirts and underwear and things to shave the face. By the way, I know what everybody commented on my haircut last week. I do think for somebody who doesn't get one very often, they always do turn out well. I do need to get haircuts more often because the feedback has been good. Speaking of haircuts, Josh Jacobs has been asked to take one by the Raiders relative to where he thinks his market's going to be. See how that works, Thomas? And so Jacobs is sitting out training camp. Chris Jones is sitting out training camp. These are two, if you go by other than Patrick Mahomes, Chris Jones is the best player on the Chiefs last year. Mm-hmm. I think other than Devontae Adams, Josh Jacobs was the best player on the Raiders last year. When you're a team builder and one of your cornerstone players, one of your best players on the team is sitting out, and we don't know where these negotiations are going, all the time. But when your best player is sitting out, kind of what's going through your mind, and are you at a constant contact with the agent, or is it something where you kind of give it a few days? How does that end up working?
No, I think you're not in constant contact. I mean, after the initial conversation and the agitation that the player does not, appear in the building, it becomes a little bit tenuous, and you get a little agitated because ultimately, when you're building a team and you're thinking about everyone being there, putting their asses on the line, you get a little agitated because you think, look, this is what we need to be a championship team. We need to all pull in the same direction. That said, everyone understands, the players in the locker room understand when sometimes these guys run into these situations. Some of the lower paid guys don't necessarily get it, but most of the players empathize with their teammates. Management, of course, does not always empathize or sympathize with the team, with the player, right? They just want him in. They want him working with the team. They want him sending messages. This guy, Josh Jacobs, obviously is very, very talented. We know that. He can kick butt at so many levels. I mean, as I understand, his desire to come back or not come back, I mean, obviously that's not what's going to happen. Josh McDaniel, as you know, I know him from New England. I mean, he's a principled guy in the sense, from the standpoint of making a decision on someone and not vacillating on it. He and Ziegler, the way that they're approaching this right now, will be interesting to see how it plays out. Look, Josh has never been, Josh, even back in his collegiate days, he had a little bit of attitude to him, right? I heard stories about him coming back, getting in trouble. Something happened, coming back the next day. I don't know if you ever heard that story where he had a piece of duct tape over his mouth and just sat in the meetings. He's just, he's got an air to him and an attitude to him that is what it is. But he is a really good football player. So, look, I'll be really interested to see how this plays out. But what do you do when it's a situation when it's your very, one of your very best players, if not your best player?
Well, I think about with running backs, particular, like we talk about what, and this is an interesting thought because it's true about Chris Jones too. The player, of course, wants to capitalize on what just happened, right? When you're Chris Jones, you were the best defensive player in all of football, modulo a couple other guys possibly, and you won a Super Bowl, and the team probably doesn't win the Super Bowl without you. If you're Josh Jacobs, you led the league in rushing. If you're Saquon Barkley, let's say, and they've resolved that, but if you're Saquon Barkley, you're one of the most productive players in the league last year at your position. You're maybe the best player on your own team. Go back a year. A year ago, Chris Jones is battling to get that 10th sack to get $1 million bonus. He was a good, not great defensive tackle in 2021. Josh Jacobs was so kind of middling that they didn't even exercise his fifth-year option as a first-round pick. And Barkley is so injured and kind of broken down that there were people, and like I'm not joking, there were people who mistook Lorenzo Booker for him in games because they had similar numbers and similar builds. And a year later, they're amazing. Like they the contract year is undefeated, and they're of course asking for how they were in 22, when the truth might be more of an average of those two types of players. And how does that, like, I know for a fact that that's the issue in a lot of cases, especially for Jones. Like, how does that, like, how do you convey that to how it's hard for me to imagine you going to an agent being like, we love Chris, for example, and he was amazing for us last year. If you broaden the scope out a little bit, he might not be that great that next year. And so we want to pay him for kind of what we think he's going to be rather than who he's been. That's a tough conversation to have.
It's not an easy conversation to have. But again, make no mistake about this. As a general manager, you're sitting down with the head coach. You're sitting down sometimes when it's a dusty situation, both words used. You sit down with your owner and you decide how you're going to approach and how you're going to affect, how it's going to affect the contracts of other players. There are so many layers to this that it's not that easy just to have an agent pipe back at you and say something that you think is quite honestly just short-sighted, because we do know our organization better. We know the direction of our organization much better than anyone. I'm talking about a general manager and a head coach and an owner, of course, where appropriate. So I've gotten in many of those discussions, and they're not easy. Sometimes you want to hang up. I made a real effort to keep my relationships with the agents in a good place. But believe me, there were some that were very, very acrimonious. And for me, they were forever, I think, scarred. But there was a line the other day with someone, you come to the table with money, you'll always heal. I think it was Mike Lombardi who said recently, like, it's a bunch of crap. Everyone's talking about this being a pain in the ass between the GM and these agents. The next deal you do, when you lay big money down on the table for them, they're coming back with a smile. So,
well, and the league has come so far. I mean, you remember the days back when guys used to just hold out for the whole training camp and miss the first game. And this was before free agency. At least now players, like, we've seen less of that because players are compensated better than they were in the past. And so, like, to your point, I feel for running backs, for example, but their lives are better than what they were back before free. Like, there are outs that players have now through CBAs. Like, I don't think the CBA has done them a ton of favors, but they're better off than where they were, let's say strikes and stuff like that. I want to, so we're talking about players and, whether to pay them or not and all this kind of stuff. I do want to, I read a book the other day that when I was on an airplane, and I had reread it because I had loved it the first time I read it, like 5-6 years ago. The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. And people like talk about Michael Lewis because he wrote Moneyball and he wrote The Blind Side. He was, The Big Short, terrific writer. And it was interesting because one of the things that Kahneman and Tversky were talking about, the two psychologists that he was chronicling in the book, is this idea of transitivity. And when it's violated, right? So think about, transitivity would be like, okay, I like this food item better than I like that food item. I like that food item better than I like this food item. Should I like the first food item more than the third, right? And that's not always the case. But I think in football, I think this transitivity idea is violated a ton, right? Like, let's say, is there ever, like, so if you're coming out with scouting grades, Thomas, and let's say one player is graded higher than another, and then the second player is graded higher than the third player, does that automatically mean you like the first player over the third player? Or could there be situations where you break that transitivity in player eval?
By the way, that book I was given to by Sean Clement recently to read to get into your worlds on, with Michael Lewis. So I definitely want to jump into that. And transitivity, as you explain it to me, I would say when we are setting up our draft boards and we are setting up our ranks, there's no question that falls into line, right? If I like A over B and I like B over C, then I like A over C, right? I was flashing all, right to the cornerback board, right? And I'm thinking, yes, there's no question. That said, there are certain elements, and I'll use Bill Belichick. We used to always, we would rank them that way, A over B, B over C, but A might be overall a better player that we like, but player C comes to the table with 3 traits that player A really doesn't necessarily possess at the same level that player C does. So for our scheme at the time and for our board, we would say we will take player C over, interestingly enough, player A at a lower level on the board, right? Or a lower pick. We would justify taking that player in the 3rd round versus player A in the 1st round because we could get those 3 salient traits from player C. Now, as I say that to you, does that mean that transitivity does not apply to that? Because we still think player A is better than player B and player C. Exactly.
Yeah, I think, right. I mean, I think that what it means is that players, and I don't know, hopefully Paul isn't listening. Paul Tudor Jones, the founder of Sumer, isn't listening to this. I think that what it means is that if you're going to boil down a player to one number, you're going to have transitivity problems, right? Or in ultimately, like even take WAR, right? Like WAR is, a really good metric for football. I think it does a pretty good job, but it in essence goes backwards, right? It's saying like at what the Falcons asked of Matt Ryan in 2016, he added 4 wins over Matt Schaub, right? If you ask Matt Schaub and Matt Ryan to do the same thing, you're going to win 4 more games if Matt's in there the whole time. I think when it looks at a forward-looking thing and it says the space of all things I can ask anybody, I might prefer Lamar Jackson to Matt Ryan if I'm going to ask him to do X, Y, and Z. I might prefer Matt Ryan to Joe Burrow if I ask Matt Ryan to do these 5 things. And I might prefer, Joe Burrow to the first player if I think as long as you restrict what you're asking the players to do, I think transitivity will pass. I think the problem is that it's so difficult to pin down what you're actually asking the players to do, if that makes sense. Like, I think if you narrow the scope of the question significantly, transitivity passes. I think if you open it up, there are so many different ways to use players that you could almost, within a group of players who are all good, I think you can prefer any one of them over any other one of them, given what you're asking them to do.
Well, yeah, this is a fascinating conversation because we start talking about how important it is to understand the upcoming scheme of your coaches, from year to year, right? You're not just locked into any defensive or offensive scheme from year to year. And in today's world, if you are truly being creative, on at least near the front end of the curve, you always have to keep people guessing. You don't want to do the same, right? Look, we got ridiculed beyond with the Falcons a couple different times with a couple different offensive coordinator where people were like, we knew exactly what he was doing because he's done it 4 years straight, and it's what he is known for, said coach. So I just know that my point there is every year making sure that you're up with your coaches and understanding what you need when you're going out to scout individuals and when you're evaluating players and when you're setting up your board, to me, is vital. And again, there are certain players that rank higher than other players that you might not necessarily want to spend the money on or the booty on as a draft player or free agency because they are not fulfilling your needs in the scheme that your respective scheme. So I don't want to turn that upside down, but we sit here and talk forever about it.
Well, I want to get this to development, which we talked about briefly last time, but there was so much cool NFL news that we kind of didn't get to that. But when we think about development, I think that this is apt, right? Because if you're like, let's say you're looking at cornerback and you're like, you have an opportunity, you have all the let's assume money's not a factor. You can trade enough and you have enough cap space to go get Jalen Ramsey, right? Versus you have the draft capital to draft Devin Witherspoon. So those two players, like, which one is better is a good question, right? If you have a Pete Carroll type coach and his staff that's willing and able to develop corners in every walk of life to a pretty good standing. And we've seen that with obviously Richard Sherman, Byron Maxwell got a big deal. Walter Thurman got a contract. Like and Tarek Woolen and Shaq Griffin, like they've done a really good job of like developing cornerbacks, right? And so if I'm thinking about if I'm looking at my roster with my coaches, I can bake in, if I'm Seattle, an elevation of that player over the course of 2-3 years on average. Whereas if I'm a team that has struggled at developing corners, I'm just going to throw a team out there. Minnesota's been a team that's struggled developing corners. That was why Patrick Peterson was so valuable to them, because he came in, he knew a defense immediately, and he played really well. But that comes at a cost, and it comes at a cost of age and money. Is like, I think that the development curve and how it changes with respect to different positions and different teams and different stages of a career, that to me, I think is a huge breaker of transitivity, because you'd almost prefer to have it depends upon where you are, right? Whether you prefer the veteran to the rookie.
Well, look, you can go to Les Snead and what his comments were. There's so much validity in the approach of knowing what you have and knowing what you don't have, right? You have a player, especially at a position like that, you know what you're dealing with, not only off the field or on the field, but off the field, right? When you're drafting someone, you are projecting. It's one of the toughest things about drafting players. And we know this in our own world, right? We could spin off on this in Sumer. The college to pro projection is not an easy activity or feat at all. There's complications there when we start talking about that model. And look, there were times contingent on the season, contingent on the scheme, contingent on the coaches we have on our staff, et cetera, that would determine whether we were going to go in free agency or whether we were going to go in the draft. And look, there are some really good young, and use this as an example, young corners out there, but no one truly knows how they're going to play out when, they get into the league. Do they have the same confidence? We've seen it. We saw it in Jacksonville with CJ. What's his name? CJ Johnson? Gosh, I always forget about him.
In Jacksonville.
Remember the Florida kid came out the same year.
CJ Henderson.
CJ Henderson came out the same year that AJ Terrell did, right? We went back and forth within our discussion about it, and I've had some fun banter with Raheem Morris about it. Raheem doesn't claim CJ, and I maybe inadvertently put it on him or mistakenly put it on him. There was someone in our building who really liked CJ. We liked Terrell. The point is, we felt more comfortable with what Terrell was going to do for us in projecting than we did CJ, right? You don't know what's going to happen.
Which, by the way, to give Raheem a little cover, when CJ Henderson was available via trade, I had multiple teams reach out to me and say, hey, what would you trade for him? He wasn't the only one interested in CJ, but like, that's funny. Like he doesn't want to claim him now because there were multiple teams. Obviously, Carolina went ahead and signed him or traded for him. But like, it's interesting, right? Because if you were looking at that draft, obviously Jeff Okudah, if you go sort of in order of how effective they've been, Okudah's been the least effective. Yeah. Then Henderson, the second least. AJ's probably been the second most effective, and then Trayvon Diggs has been the most effective out of, and that's kind of the order in which they were drafted in reverse. And it's just funny, but I think about pre-Dan Quinn, and Diggs was not very good, right? Like they were throwing on him all day. He goes and gets a coach in Dan Quinn that's willing to like, hey, you play into your athleticism, play into your risk taking, and they've made a good corner out of him. And maybe if it was different, maybe if he went to Jacksonville instead, who knows what would happen. But that's all to my point of like this idea of development, this idea of players. I think that there are, especially because of how popular the draft has become, Thomas. Like I think we like to think of players as like finished products right when they get drafted, right? Like we stop caring so much about them, and it's tough because I think in a lot of cases, like we almost have to like set it and forget it with some guy. Andrew Thomas couldn't block anything his first year, and now he's got a $25 million deal with the New York Giants because of being able to develop. And it's like people were ready to write him off as the 4th overall pick in year 1.
Oh, yeah. Look, this is a great conversation because, again, please don't sort of underestimate the idea about knowing your job as a general manager and your job as a head coach is to know your staffs too, right? Know which staffs are good developers, which staffs are good with young guys, which staffs only want older guys, which part of the staff want older guys, which coaches. It's the same with us on the personnel side, who your adept scouts are with the O-line, even though they're scouting everyone and evaluating everyone. That's our jobs as head coach and general manager to know what we have within our building. Back to this. If you have a defensive back coach who's not a developer or doesn't have patience with the young guys, you better know your staff and you better have that conversation as a GM with your head coach. And
when you draft somebody at a position that you don't that your team doesn't develop well, what ends up being the straits? It's not great, right? And I actually want to like propose something to you because I've been thinking about this a lot over the past couple of weeks in thinking about training camp and thinking about the NFL at large. If you had a good grasp, which I think we do, on what age curves are like in the NFL, what positions you have a best chance of developing, and you understood kind of free agency and what's cheap to acquire in free agency, and you knew your coaching staff, and this is the thing that we'll never know on the outside as well as somebody on the inside does. Thomas, do you think that how much would that change your approach in drafting in free agency? And is that enough of it? I feel like it's enough to give you an edge.
I feel like it is enough to give us an edge for sure. You're bringing me into this. So your exact question is what? Because I got all kinds of stuff going on with this storm.
Yeah, but like so for example, if you knew that linebackers are readily available in free agency, and you're hiring a coaching staff, and I know this is different than what happened in Atlanta, but if you know that linebackers and safeties, for example, are readily available in free agency, would that change your approach to hiring a staff? Conversely, if I know that an offensive line coach that can develop 5 guys is like Mike Tice or Jeff Stoutland or Bill Callahan, somebody like that. If I know an offensive line, Dante Scarnecchia before he retired, I'm going to be more willing to spend my uncapped dollars on an offensive line coach than I would be a linebacker coach, because I know that if an offensive line coach can develop above his weight class, it's going to be worth way more than if a linebackers coach does, because of how hard it is to sign veteran offensive linemen versus how relatively easy it is to sign veteran linebackers.
Okay, so this is something you're leading me right down the line, and it's what you and I believe strongly about, and we are leading into Sumer Sports here. any of those NFL people that are listening, this is a part of what we are working on in Sumer, which we think can be groundbreaking. The whole different approach to putting together staffs. Any of you rising executives, mid-level executives that are interested, data people that are interested in being assistant GMs and GMs, about putting the staff together with your head coach, this is a vital side versus just going down the line, hiring coaches that are your loyal myrmidons. That will not pull its weight anymore. And third parties, I like to think, like Sumer, are going to get deeply into the idea of really pulling out all the intelligentsia of guys like Eric and Sean Clement and many, many more within our building to, again, literally pull out and juxtapose the data between this coach and this coach, or this approach to your coaching staff and this approach to your coaching staff. Again, the days of just kind of whimsically putting together a staff are done. The coaches, and I have some great coaching friends, and I've said this time and again, the coaches can make or break an organization for sure. And I'm not just talking about a head coach or a coordinator. I am talking about your position coaches who are vital to the development of your football team and your ultimately your resources.
Yeah, for sure. Because I think there's just so many ways in which, in my opinion, we look at the way the league is put together, and we look at it, we look at it, and we say, there's a corner, like there's you're putting a lot in for not that much output here, and you're not putting a lot in, and there's so much opportunity here for growth. Like I think like, and he, the late Tony Sperano is another one. Like I just think about all these OG offensive line coaches that have been able to take offensive lines, not a ton of practice time anymore, not a ton of cohesive time, not a lot of schemes in college. Like you draft Andre Dillard in the first round, and Howie's a great general manager. But like you draft Andre Dillard in the first round, how many times did Andre Dillard actually do an NFL pass set at Wazoo? Like not very much, right?
Yep.
So you need Jeff Stoutland to develop him, or even better, develop Jordan Mailata, who is supposed to be his backup, into a reasonable player. And all of that is to say, like, that's money that's uncapped. When we build our models at Sumer, you can spend whatever the hell you want on Jeff Stoutland. You can spend whatever the hell you want on Jeff Albrecht, your linebackers coach, who did a great job with Devondre and Duke and Dion. And like I think that's a place where there's an edge to be had. And I don't know if that many people are explicitly thinking about that.
Well, look, I think there's only one Jeff Stoutland. I'm a huge fan, was a huge fan, and always am a huge fan of Dante Scarnecchia. He's no longer working in the league, of course. But back to what we've always said, there are coaching trees. I'm not just talking about head coaching trees. There are trees along people that have come through the systems with Dante Scarnecchia who make them that much more adept at doing what they're doing regarding development than other O-line coaches out there. So yes, I just say being more sort of thoughtful in the approach of putting together the staffs is going to be a really important thing in the future. And I think how we measure them is going to be important. And if companies can go out there in particular and provide data and background to some of these head coaches and general managers and owners, that they literally can juxtapose those coaches that they're looking at because they're close and they're loyalists to the ones that are out there that are going to better the organization because they truly, analytically are showing that they are producing better and more. Look, we say this all the time. You only get better at what you measure. And for way too long in our league, assistant coaches have not been measured truly on the development of what they're doing. And we've talked about that as well, Eric, right? Yeah. I am a believer in that coach is not just evaluated, should not just be evaluated on his ability to scheme on a chalkboard, so to speak. There are so many facets. There's meeting room, there's communication ability, there's leadership ability, there's game planning, of course, there's development, which is right up there. There are so many elements to a coach's evaluation. And if you look at all of the elements, just like a player has a metric tree, coaches have a metric tree. And they literally have to score well in that metric tree to, in my mind, to be considered for, a legitimate role on an NFL team. You can't just by virtue of I've been in it 20 years, continue to be at the top of your game, because that's not how it works anymore.
Yeah, for sure. And it's just the same thing with players, right? Like you have to evaluate players given the context, given what's expected of them. And to your point, like much like we had a dearth in player, like public player eval was not a thing until like 15 years ago. Coaching, that's something, again, that's just an immense value, and people are leaving dollar bills on the ground there. Now we've gotten through more of this podcast, Thomas, than frankly I would have thought. You're on your phone right now. I think this is a great conversation topic. That's why, I wanted to push through today, and I'm glad that the people got to hear it. We are going to continue to have, the Sumer Sports Show with Eric Eager and Thomas Dimitroff 2 times a week, starting the fall. We are also going to have more of Tay Seth, Sean Syed, and Parker Fleming, who have done a great job of filling in for the two of us admirably over the past few months when we've taken some time off of the show. This is going to be your place, this YouTube channel, as well as sumersports.com. It's going to be your place for football intelligence. We really appreciate you coming. Really appreciate your patience, as both Thomas and I had some technical difficulties here. Before we go, Thomas, any parting words? I can't wait to watch another football game with you and hear like you live, because you were on one during the Hall of Fame game. You were so much fun. And you even made fun of me a few times, which is of course great. I can't wait. We have 2 games Thursday, 6 games on Saturday, and I think another 6 games on Friday, another 6 games on Saturday. I can't wait for this weekend. Thomas, any parting thoughts?
No, parting thoughts are exactly what you're talking about. I'm excited about our slate of shows through the season here. I love the idea that we are going to touch on, legitimate news points in both of our Monday and Wednesday takes. I'm excited about that. Look, as we continue to have strong opinions, I like talking about them. I think they're current, and I think it's important for Sumer to have a stance on some of these ideas, of course. And I want to continue to fold in the information that your ability to educate people on where Sumer is and what Sumer is bringing to the table, I think is fascinating. And so I'm excited about where we're going.
For all of you that like this content, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We're almost to 2,000 followers on subscribers. I'm sorry, on YouTube, almost to 8,000 followers on Twitter. Tell somebody about the show, and we thank you greatly for your loyalty. So, for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been episode 88 of the Sumer Sports Show.